Douglas, thanks for joining us here in Entrevista Digital. Where are you? Are you in London right now?
I'm in London right now, yes. It's very good to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure for us, and we would like to talk about the madness of the crowds. Today here in Spain, I would like to tell you this. Today here in Spain, a YouTube channel was closed for a week for spreading images of empty hospitals and not chaotic and clogged as the Pedro Sánchez government says. The reason for that closure was, according to YouTube, was that those images differed from the version given by the World Health Organization about the coronavirus. So in your book, you said, the business model of these big techs, Google, Twitter, Facebook, relying on finding customers ready to pay to modify someone else's behavior. Douglas, that's pretty scary. How can we counteract the power of big tech company?
Yes, that's right. It's very good to be with you. It's a very tricky case when you give, because when a platform as big as YouTube decides that something just goes, I mean, there are other platforms, but like Facebook, Twitter, and Google. When YouTube makes a decision, it's pretty terminal for the video in question. The main tech companies have a control over what people are able to think and say, which is unparalleled in human history. The good side of it is that we're able to exchange good ideas across continents in record speed time, attracting huge audiences, and an enormous amount of good and progress can be achieved in this fashion. But the downside is that the tech companies have increasingly taken it upon themselves to decide what is incorrect thought and incorrect speech. And by the way, they've done so, and the example you give is a very pertinent one. They've done so in a fashion that suggests that they have just never thought through any of the consequences of the situation they find themselves in. It's not like our continent has never thought about free speech or publishing issues before. The history of Europe is rife with examples of people trying to suppress ideas and ideas bursting out anyway. People trying to keep books down and the books bursting out anyway. But in the modern era, it is terrifying because I say the power they have is far greater than any other force in history to not only promote but to repress opinion.
Even here in Spain, the government now, with the excuse of the Franco's dictatorship, now they want to control not only the thought right now, but the memories of that dictatorship. So
yes, well, I mean, you know this better than me, but I mean, the debate over the Spanish past is such a live issue, always still, and my own feeling about it has always been that rather than try to repress any idea, you should always allow as many ideas as possible and as many opinions as possible to flourish, in the belief that the good opinions will hold out. I've been very struck in recent years by the overcorrection, as I see it, that's been occurring, where in issues after issues, we try to, individual companies and governments try to sort of correct opinion by behaving in a way that shuts down, restricts, limits the range of expression of views. By the way, there's an interesting example I discovered a little while ago when I was in a neighboring country in Portugal. I discovered that in Portugal they had a poll a few years ago. I think most countries had it of our greatest. We in Britain we had the greatest ever Brit, and various people did television programs about contenders, and then it was won in the end by Winston Churchill. And when I was in Portugal a couple of years ago, I discovered from one of my translators there that they had done the similar program some years ago, The Greatest Portuguese, and when she said it was only done once, and I said why, and she looked at me and I said, oh no, And she said, yes. I said, Salazar won. She said, yes. I said, oh, what a disaster for the organizers. But of course, it is interesting that such a thing could happen. And I would have thought that it would be very, very worth looking into and asking why or how that could be the case. But increasingly in our era, people don't like to ask why or how. They just want to say what you should believe and what you should say. And that does make a lot of things, including historical analysis, quite tricky.
You also mentioned examples of censorship at the BBC, for instance, and New York Times. The same happened here in Spain. The company that verifies fake news, for example, on Facebook is owned by a journalist who at the same time is a big fan, a big defender at all costs of Pedro Sanchez's government. So, and we suffer as a media that is very critical with Pedro Sanchez. We suffer that censorship in Facebook. And why is the left so afraid of freedom?
Well, I think I don't think the left per se. I think a lot of people are. I think they fear what the consequences of, for instance, untrammeled free thought and free debate might be. They don't essentially trust their fellow citizen, or they don't trust what they might do with it. Fake news, by the way, I should say, is an interesting, complex phenomenon. I think it's a very inexact term, and it encompasses quite a number of things, which is just worth dwelling on for a second. The first is that what a lot of people mean when they say fake news is news that is totally made up, that is completely false. And that could be one definition of fake news. The problem is there's lots of other definitions that we're working with as well. I mean, one, for instance, which I think would probably better reflect what a lot of the public feel, is news that is edited in such a way as to be clearly biased. So particular people come out badly, whatever happens.
Yeah.
And that's a much more common and disturbing thing, because, you know, again, our societies already have, and most of our countries, we have laws in place that prevent newspapers just lying. Most people, that's not what they mean by fake news. They mean this more subtle thing. How do you present the world? How do you portray certain people? That, by the way, is, I think is what Trump talks about when he means fake news. I don't think he only means making things up. I think it's also his, you know, revulsion of people framing what he does in a certain way. The truth is, I think that happens in every direction, but it's extremely hard for any legislative body to have a grip on that, because, you know, in the end, people will, to a certain extent, migrate towards the places that reflect their own worldview. And in a marketplace of ideas, I don't think that's any bad thing. I mean, we have a left-wing newspaper in Britain that does a sort of form of fake news because it presents the world in a certain way, but they're failing very badly at the moment.
In your book, suddenly, after most of us has hoped it had become a non-issue, everything seemed to have become about race. Black Lives Matter. Is about race or is about power?
Both. To a great extent, it uses race as a way to assert power, and that's very troubling. I think, as a friend of mine I was just speaking to said, from a podcast called Zubi, said that there are a lot of people for whom this is clearly about nothing other than revenge at this point. I mean, there are people who are speaking in an extraordinarily vengeful tone of voice. Not just about institutions, but for instance, about all white people. I don't like it. I don't like people who generalize about people by skin color. I don't like it, whatever direction they do it in. I think it's highly ugly. I think it's one of the ugliest, most atavistic things in our species. And I deplore it if it's done by, you know, people against black people. I deplore it when it's done against white people. I think it's a very sad, should be by now left behind element of our species. And yet, at the very moment when we've come better to equality than at any point in our societies, We have people wishing to re-racialize our societies along ethnic lines in the name of tolerance. And by the way, I mean, a lot of that in Europe is the spillover of a specific American culture war, which is now being used as the way to frame racial understanding across the globe. And I don't think it's very useful, any more than if we all imported, you know, Nigeria or China or anywhere else.
We have here Podemos, that is the radical left party. They receive financial money from Iran, a country that hung homosexuals, and they pretend to be a feminist party, and they pretend to defend the rights of the homosexuals. So, and they don't see any contradiction in that.
No, well, this is a common theme in my own country. Jeremy Corbyn, who was leader of the Labour Party, enriched himself financially at the coffers of the Iranian government. He presented programs for the Iranian press TV mouthpiece of the Iranian government, the revolutionary Iranian government, and made himself some tens of thousands of pounds from that. But yet he presents himself as being, you know, on the side of gays, on the side of LGBT, on the side of women. These people are walking contradictions. That's their own tragedy. All that everyone else can do is to point that out and to make sure they don't ever get into power. Of course, it's too late in some cases, but this is a constant. I mean, everything is. Everyone has a capacity to be hypocritical, but